Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Contemporary Issues class. What a good crowd we have today. We are so pleased to have Dr. Peter Van Arsdale today here to talk about human rights. So there's obviously a theological connection. We are obligated to treat people with decency and respect, and that involves human rights. So we're looking forward to hearing about human rights around the world today. Before we do that, our usual announcements. Zoomers, welcome. Nice to have, looks like 8 or 10 of you this morning. And please mute yourself in the lower left corner of your screen when you're not speaking. And we are recording this for future playback. And if we have any first timers here, we want to welcome you all. I'm Steve, the class leader, and we send out a weekly email with our upcoming topics and would like to invite you to sign up for that too. Any other announcements? Anything going on we haven't covered today? Nice to see everybody back for end of summer, September starting, and more people returning back to church and more classes too. So look on the website and see all the classes that are starting here this fall too. And you're teaching another one too.
Yeah.
On social justice, I understand.
Yeah, with our friend Keith Winkle.
Yes, good. That's wonderful. Okay, with that, I want to do a brief introduction of the biography of Dr. Van Arsdale, and then giving plenty of time to present and for questions. Do you want to take questions during your presentation, or you want to wait?
If there's something unfamiliar, Noreen, it's fine, but otherwise at the end.
Otherwise, yes, okay. Dr. Van Arsdale is a St. Andrew member and an anthropologist who recently retired as director of the African Initiatives at the University of Denver, where he's also a senior lecturer. He's also the author of several books and is the former president of the National Association for the Practice of Anthropology. He has worked in countries worldwide, including Sudan, Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, Bosnia, Romania, Israel, and others. You have been around the world. He's worked on refugee issues, resource development, and human rights. And as I mentioned in my email to you, he has written about human trafficking, gay rights, and their persecutions in Africa, especially children's rights and other related situations around the world. And we know about recent ones that have been in the news in Russia and other countries. So we are welcome to have you and pleased to have you today. Thank you for being here.
Good, thanks, Steve. It's great to see you, and I'll use this microphone at some points, and maybe I won't use it at some points because no one has ever accused me of talking quietly. And in this case, that's good. In this nice group of great friends and folks that we have here. About 11 years ago, just as the country of South Sudan was coming on board as the world's newest nation in East Africa, I had the privilege of co-leading a seminar, a training seminar for American and South Sudanese people on human rights. And this seminar went well. I was enervated by the wonderful South Sudanese people, men and women that I met. And at the end of the seminar, 2 of the participants who had also been lost boys came to me and said, Dr. Van Arsdale, we have a gift for you. Oh, that's wonderful, thank you. They said, it's a cane. It's a cane of the elders. It reflects wisdom. I said, humbled and honored to receive such a gift. And they said, there's something else that you need to know. With this gift comes an obligation. If you receive this, to the best of your ability, you must always help with human rights until you die. I said, I will. And I am.
Yeah.
So that was quite something. It really struck my heart, and it was a real privilege. When we talk about human rights, and we'll get into lots of details, we can't cover all those areas. We can't cover all the areas of human trafficking and child abuse and all the others today. We'll just touch on some ones that I hope you'll find of interest and they're gripping. But as we do, and as we think of what we should do as humans here at St. Andrews and beyond, I sometimes think of these three words, I lightheartedly call them the UDs. The could, the would, and the should of life. If you're asked to help with, let's say, a human rights issue here or abroad, what could you do with what you know? Second, would. If you have the time and the people have asked for your help, you're not imposing yourself, what would you do? And third, to help make a difference. You're already smiling because you know this is going, what should you do? You must help. If all three of the UDs are in place, you and I, we must help to the best of our ability. The presentation I'm making today, you have the first handout. I brought 40 copies, and gee, I hope there were enough. Oh, great. Is there a couple more copies, Donnie, back there? Oh, good. If you'd be kind enough to share them, it looks like I brought just about the right number. The presentation I'm making today is in part built upon various publications that Steve so nicely referenced, but particularly upon a publication I've done for Oxford University Press for their encyclopedia. And the publication that I wrote is entitled Global Human Rights. So today I'm speaking about global human rights and based on excerpts from my encyclopedia article. I won't be reading much to you because I like to talk extemporaneously, of course, but a few excerpts I think will be helpful. To start, there's no theory of human rights. There are theories, there are ideas, there are protocols, there are principles, there are wrestling matches around what they should be worldwide. As an anthropologist, I've been blessed to think about them worldwide. And if you notice at the top of my handout, it mentions Bosnia, South Sudan, and Ethiopia. Those are three places where I've tried to learn more about and wrestle with human rights. But having said that, there is a commonality or thread that we need to share. Global human rights, writ large, impact the entire human condition. They span cultural, social, economic, ecological, political, and civic realms. And by the way, human rights are not civil rights, but they're complementary, of course, in many ways. Human rights pertain to how people are treated, protected, and respected. They are interrelated, interdependent, and of importance to all people. Yet in actuality, as they play out, they do not apply equally to all people. They have not been formulated by representatives of all societies. They have not been accepted by members of all societies and nation states. And they have not in any sense been formally approved by many transnational bodies. So it's a tough and interesting and still evolving field. As I like to say, and I believe in God just as you do, human rights didn't come from God, nor at the other extreme did they bubble up from the primeval ooze. No, human rights come from human discourse, human interaction, human actions, human failures, human successes, and what we try to do to better help and protect. That's where human rights come from. The actions of victims, survivors, and perpetrators, as well as service providers, advocates, and everyday citizens like us, do stand out. And these often stand out in ways that I've written about called the work of the radical others. And we got radical others right here in this church. Somebody doing something, not for fame or fortune, but making a radical difference in some way. And I'll have a few examples of famous and not famous people that I'll share with you in this regard. Well, now, take a peek at this handout that I've shared with you. You'll be glad to know that I won't be talking about everything on this handout because that would take a bit of time and we don't have that much time. But as I formulated it for the Oxford Encyclopedia, and then extracted it for some other things like a program I was doing at DU. I thought it was good to look at, as you can tell by reading through it, what are some of the concepts and ideas that have evolved just in the last 500 or 600 years? We could go back earlier, but just in some of the last 500 or 600 years. What are some of the selected approaches and disciplines in the center column? And what are some selected documents and events that stand out? And remember, I'm an anthropologist, so some of these are cross-culturally attuned, you know, from other cultures as well as our own Euro-Western civilization. So just may I point out a few highlights, and then we'll get into some details. Early on, with the voyages of discovery, no surprise, as the 1500s and 1600s rolled on, particularly under European explorers, new people were being discovered and new insights were being gained. But at that time, often it was, whether they used the word or not, in English or not, it was the other with a capital O. The other folks, those other people.
We still do that.
We still do it, Steve, and you've mentioned it, and this has previously been mentioned in this very class. The other, negatively with a capital O, as opposed to small o, which might mean another person that you like to meet. So, yes, it was great to discover, but the others were still out there, indigenous, different, weird, strange, primitive. But again, during this age of discovery enlightenment, certainly, and much of it from Western writers such as John Locke and others, important insights were being made, and better understanding of what it means to be human, broadly speaking, were unfolding. So, of course, there was historical documentation, philosophic inquiry. Philosophers were gaining strength, right? Natural science was gaining footings. What it meant to truly be, early on, in the footsteps of Francis Bacon and others, a scientist, that was gaining steam with including the experimental method. Just briefly, you notice I put De las Casas in Defense of the Indians, 1545. That was one of the earliest, in my view, insightful writings by a person who saw what was happening to indigenous people in the Americas by the colonialists and other conquistadores, and wrote a very sensible tract in terms of the humanity of indigenous people that were being encountered in the Americas. So it's well worth remembering the early writings. If you read them today, you wouldn't think they were entirely modern, but you'd see insights into what it meant to appreciate other people. See, that's part of the understanding of human rights, to appreciate folks and understand them for their similarities and differences. And then, of course, even early on, Rousseau's social contract, while still Euro-American attuned, was important. And of course, then things like the Bill of Rights, great development, the French Declaration of Rights, great developments. In the industrial age, and again, I'm just skimming over some of the highlights to kind of set you on board here. In the industrial age and the scientific innovation age, as I've called it here, in subsequent decades on into the 17 and 1800s, even into the early 1900s, the notion of progress through reason came about. That's extremely important, that you're not just, that societies aren't just progressing in some fashion with a kind of Euro-American civilizing mandate. No, reason is key. And reasoning about what's beneficial and not beneficial to folks is increasingly key. Progress through reason. The word, by the way, the word progress is still highly charged term, and it's very still controversial, but anyhow, this is what was playing out. The culture concept. What does it mean to better understand people's cultures and appreciate the nuances and differences and similarities? That gained traction. Of particular interest to us anthropologists, but I think to you folks too, is this notion of Aboriginal protection. That came out in this era, late 1700s on into the early 1800s, particularly with the Euro-American flair, but that's okay. And interestingly, folks in London with the Aboriginal Protection Society it might have been founded, I don't remember the exact date, maybe 1845, 1850, something like that, was one of the first societies where people got together to try to formulate ways to help other people. Now, that sounds noble, and it was meant to be. The people in that society were wealthy, well-heeled white people.
Was Wilberforce part of that?
They were not part of that, but complementary.
Okay.
Good comment. So, well intended. What can we do? They were saying, for example, to help the Aboriginals of Australia, which by that time were well known and of course had been subjected already to harshness. But it was the notion of a society, at least of people coming together to help someone with a human rights thrust, even though again, it was in some ways elitist. You notice I also have, of course, I couldn't help but put a few anthropological things in the center section here, so you'll forgive me for that. Things like emergent ethnography. But what that means is, you know, scientists, social scientists, I'm a social scientist, an anthropologist is a social scientist, getting out there, meeting people, collecting information, and that's good. Hopefully being good listeners, that's all good. But much of that happened, though, my friends, under colonial regimes. So, you know, a German ethnographer got out there, but he also might be seen, including by the indigenous people he was interested in studying, as a colonial representative, with pluses and minuses associated with that. Still, lots of data was coming in, and you can guess in that era, what would have early anthropologists been interested in? Customs, the customs of people.
Peter, anthropology means the study of cultures, is that right?
Broadly speaking, and the culture of humankind in that regard, in context, exactly right. So you can see why early anthropologists, early ethnographers, of course, were interested in gaining information and in doing that. Now, a sip of this coffee will enervate me for the next 6 minutes.
I never heard that estimate.
You've never heard that. My wife, which Kathy's here, she might say at least the next 5 minutes. Just a few interesting things on the right side of that chart under industrial age and scientific innovation. I'll come back in a moment to Dana, the seaman's friend, but I want to call your attention to Dunant, the memory of Solferino in 1862. That Henri Dunant's work in Europe at that time around understanding the battles that had taken place near Solferino and what had happened to not only the soldiers who were wounded or killed, but the civilians who were wounded or killed or displaced. In my view, and in other scientists' view, his insights into better understanding the broad range of battlefield casualties and subsequent trauma after battles was brilliant, and it set the stage for the Red Cross movement and for the Geneva Conventions.
Wow.
The first Geneva Conventions came out in the late 1860s. And then, of course, more recent ones in the 20th century. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Because of his concern with folks across the battlefield, not just soldiers. Think about that with Ukraine and what we're seeing with all the folks traumatized, killed, and injured, so many being civilians, including children. Now, the Ghost Ranch religion, I'll briefly mention, because that's an example amongst indigenous American Indians of people who were responding to this onslaught of colonialism, of American frontierism, of the expansion of the United States, state by state, of course, moving west over those periods of time. And briefly, the ghost dance is a revitalization movement, meaning they're attempting to revitalize their traditional culture and religion against the onslaught of what they saw as unfortunate Western incursions.
Wounded Knee.
I'm sorry.
Wounded Knee,
Well,
1895.
that's a spinoff from it. Absolutely right. That's a spinoff from the Ghost Dance. It was about the same time.
Yep.
That's exactly right. The only reason I put Ishi, the last of his tribe here, and I see that show you the dates of his life and death, is that he was held out as an American Indian, maybe the last of his California tribe, by a famous anthropologist named Alfred Kroeber. And while that's fine, and the fact that he was studied and appreciated, but also paraded around like a museum piece, ultimately was pretty sad. But people said in those early days of the 20th century, is he truly the last truly indigenous person in California, if not beyond? But the notion of a kind of a museum piece overhung that, particularly as we look back on it. And he was basically treated as a museum piece until he died. So with those backgrounds in place, before we talk about post-World War II and the globalization, let me share a few more points, just one more point, really. It's the point about dignity. Dignity is something I've been privileged to write about. I don't claim to understand it fully, but I keep working on it, because dignity is central to our understanding of a human's human rights. And if we truly could respect a person's dignity and what that means, and appreciate the fact that that means that they have control over their own body, and this is seen in such things as women's rights movements and the pro-life, pro-choice debates, many other things it plays out in terms of the bodily perception, but beyond, in terms of the sister term to dignity, which is autonomy. If both dignity and autonomy, and we started to get into it in this industrial age and scientific innovation age a bit, starting to understand it a bit, if both dignity and autonomy could truly be respected, let's just use an obvious example. There would not be a single rape, because rape violates dignity and autonomy of a person. If it was truly respected, there would not be one rape in the world, but of course it's not truly respected, and people falter and people are abused, sadly. So my friends, that was for me, one of the most important, and I'm not the only one, insights coming out of that period and on into the current day. What we could do to understand dignity and its sister term, autonomy. Now, the other essential principle is justice. And justice is much more than doing what's right, although that's part of it. For those who are abused, for those who are oppressed, yes. It includes the design of constitutions tied to the rule of law. It includes the effective management of the political order. It includes working towards stable socioeconomic organizations which will support the political order. And of course, appropriate understanding of civil rights and civil disobedience. So justice, my friends, is more of a term, equally as important as dignity, that goes more to groups or institutions or societies. Dignity is more of a term that goes to individuals. You can see why they're complementary, both absolutely essential. We were starting to get notions of these coming out of that era of the late 1800s and on into the 1900s. And now they've become, luckily, better understood and discussed. Well, as we move into the post-World War II and globalization era, you notice I've highlighted some things that I hope you'll find of interest. We better understand, don't we, diversity. Finally, diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI. I'm a Rotarian. That's now very forefront in Rotary. I'm delighted to say it wasn't 5 years ago. Now it is. Of course, our church is well engaged in DEI activities and thought. So that understanding is much more ensconced since World War II. I mentioned, of course, radical others and better understanding. I'll give you some examples of them soon. I won't have a chance to talk about all of them on here. I do want to call your attention we'll get to the tree of rights. The tree of rights is at the lower left-hand corner, but we'll get to that because I have a diagram for that on my second screen. Could folks see that, still see the first chart, see it on the screen?
Yes, I'll put that up again.
Yeah, just in case you're wanting to look at the screen versus your own handout. Oh, yeah, thanks, that's perfect,
They
Steve.
can't read it.
Oh, no, that's okay, but,
They.
well, Jim can, he's right here, it's perfect. Maybe, his eyeballs going up. So, I want to call your attention, though, it's right down here, and we'll get to it in a few minutes, is the tree of rights. Right above it, though, I mentioned the theory of structural violence. Now, this is interesting, very interesting. I didn't develop the notion, but others did, and I've tried to work with it. It's the notion that not necessarily are you hitting or killing or maiming someone, that's certainly violence, but it's the institutional context within which violence occurs and can be perpetrated and can bring people down. Structural violence is seen in places like the favelas in Brazil, where people who are struggling on the margins are further oppressed by the economic and police situation in their neighborhoods. And while they're not necessarily been beaten over the head every night, although some are sadly, structural violence means their abuse, their downward trend, and the tough ability to try to get out of that environment. That's what structural violence, it's institutional.
Peter, would that include in America, police retraining, police violence?
Yes, if we think about police violence in America, that would be seen as a part of structural violence. Police retraining would hopefully be a positive thrust to minimize structural violence, absolutely. Because we see it in our country too. Yeah, Steve is absolutely right. So I just want to call your attention to that important concept. You notice in the center column, post-World War II, I mentioned several things of importance. They're all important, but you notice I mentioned since our church is such an advocate on behalf of gay rights, we stand at the forefront. I was delighted. One of my neighbors came by my house. You know, I have our colorful gay rights sign, you know, the one we created that has all the bright colors. I have that in our, Kathy and I have that in our front yard. One of my neighbors just came by the other day and said, wow, was I ever glad to see that sign in your front yard. So keep those signs up, because I know others of you have those signs in your front yards too. So the Human Rights Campaign for gay rights, gay justice, of course, has come and evolved in the post-World War era. It's very important. But something less known perhaps is the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. Those are folks in that critically impacted area in the Syrian, Jordanian, Turkish border regions where the camps are and all the displaced people are, and where Assad, who, by the way, I rank right equal with Hitler and Stalin as an evil person. And by the way, I believe in the term evil, including its theological implications. I believe in that term and I use it.
Amen.
In that area, these folks, the Syrian Observatory folks, it's not a telescopic observatory. It's an on-the-ground observatory. They're tracking and trying to help the people in those areas. And it's tough because, of course, some of them have been killed. The observatory people as well. But isn't it great that we see some of those exciting developments where people working on the ground in different areas such as Syria. And then, of course, briefly, I mentioned some of the documents that have emerged in the post-World War II era. You're familiar with some like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You know, Eleanor Roosevelt had a big role in that.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah, she was a great advocate and spokeswoman. But others later came about, like the African Charter on Human Rights, the UN Convention Against Torture, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Minorities. Looks like there's a little misprint there, but the UNHCR founded, it says not 19936, but that's not quite right. It's supposed to say 1996, 1996. And then, of course, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which is quite new.
Yeah.
And that's involved, luckily, the input of Indigenous people, not just good-looking folks like us. Although we are pretty good looking. Let me say that. Lighthearted. So, all of these things have unfolded, my friends. In this 500 or 600 year period, they're still unfolding. So that's why we say that human rights evolve. They change. They are not static. They have input from different people. Increasingly, we hope, from indigenous people as well. Well, here are a few of the actual events that are important to know, that are ominous, but worth remembering. For example, a positive development, and I got this from Mark Feldmeyer and quoted Mark in my Oxford University article, as he reminded me of what Daoud Nasser, the leader of a nonprofit organization called the Tent of Nations, based in Bethlehem, where Keith and I traveled so many years ago together, with our friend Linda, by the way, I might say, the three of us among others who might be here on that famous trip. At least we thought it was famous. In that Tent of Nations, this Palestinian Christian is a visionary who's bridging Christian, Judaic, and where he can, Islamic interests. Well, there are other folks doing that, but he's well known for doing it. And I wanted to mention it also because in 2017, some of you may have heard, the Tent of Nations received the World Methodist Council Peace Award. Wow, pretty cool. So us Methodists have been in there doing things and working with other folks like Daoud Nasser. So some of the stories I have to tell are positive like that, but there are negative stories. In El Salvador, where I've worked, in 1981, December 11th, 1981, the infamous El Mozote, in case you're taking notes, it's EL capital MOZOTE, the El Mozote massacre occurred.
Oh, yeah.
As that massacre came to be studied by investigators, Salvadoran and others, it came to be sadly found that the culprits were affiliated with the Salvadoran army.
Yep.
Well, of course, armies have been in sad positions elsewhere in the world too, but this is one of the, I'm sorry?
And we funded them.
We were funding, that is correct, El Salvadoran training at that time. That is correct. I was there near that time, but not exactly at that date. So the good news that came out of it, though, was a truth commission was formed. So I wanted to mention briefly that truth commissions are an important development in the post-World War II era in our world. There have been truth commissions in Timor-Leste, in El Salvador, in Nicaragua, in various countries around the world, trying to get at, in several in Africa, trying to get at the truth of what happened in a serious, sad event like this.
Were you in El Salvador when Romero was assassinated?
No, I was not there at that time. I was there a little bit after the assassination of Romero.
Okay.
Yep. But that was a key event.
Oh, yeah.
It was a key event. So truth commissions, such as the one in El Salvador, have been very helpful. And they've come up in several countries and they try to get folks together to investigate. Including, interestingly, so keep putting in these plugs for anthropology, because of course I like anthropology. Forensic anthropologists were able to get into grave sites and other remains and try to help humanely identify and then reunite the remains with the loved ones who survived. That happened in El Salvador too. Well, here's another important event and person to tell you about. This person is Irina Sendler, Sendler. She's another radical other. And as I wrote about, a real exemplar of courage during the World War II and then inspiring people post-World War II era. She was working for Warsaw's Social Welfare Department as the war broke out in the early 1940s. And she watched as Germany invading Poland packed 350,000 Jews into the Warsaw Ghetto. Most of us here have heard of the infamous Warsaw Ghetto. A Catholic person, Irina Sendler, foresaw what their fates, the Jewish fate, might be. She joined Zegota, an underground movement that was aimed at helping folks. And she took on the name Jolanta because she didn't want to be identified and didn't want her work to be curtailed by being, of course, captured by the Germans and probably executed. So her task became smuggling children out of the Warsaw Ghetto safely. She ultimately saved the lives of approximately 2,500 children
Wow.
through her work and through the aid of her pals in Zegota. Isn't that something?
Yeah.
Unbelievable. What a courageous person. So in the human rights field, we find courage being exemplified. Unbelievable.
Peter, just time check, it's 11:12. I know you want to leave
Perfect.
time for
And
questions.
for a second chart. But we're on target.
Okay,
Good. Because would you be so kind as to bring up my second slide?
sure.
And would you folks be so kind as to pass out? Jim, I'll give you the start again, my friend. Maybe I'll start with my pal Kathy over here to start the other half. Thank you.
Gotta plug the drive back in. Well, there it is.
Yeah.
The tree of it.
So this, as I alluded to a few moments ago, Steve will bring it up on the screen also, is the Tree of Rights. I had the privilege of developing this metaphor, aided by colleagues from South Sudan. And as Kathy knows, because she's heard me tell the story a half dozen times, and she always so politely listens to my stories, including the ones I've told at least 12 times over the time we've been married. And always is so smiling and friendly and a good listener. As she heard me say at least 6 times, I was laid in bed in the middle of the night, just like many of us do now, where we occasionally are awake in the middle of the night, you know. And occasionally we think of something profound, and usually we don't. But one night, about 10 or 11 years ago, at the time that I was in South Sudan and working with that human rights seminar, where I was so honored to receive this cane of wisdom, I thought, when talking about human rights cross-culturally and to different people, whether in the United States or in South Sudan or Bosnia or Ethiopia or anywhere else, I don't think it's so good to just write down all of these principles, even though they're well-intended, in long treatises, of which many of our overseas friends won't be interested in reading, or if they don't speak English, won't be able to read at all. Or if they translate, they won't be able to translate them easily into their own indigenous language. I thought, it literally hit me. Why don't I use a tree as a metaphor? People love visuals. In every country where I've worked, and I've been privileged, as Steve said, to work in many, I found that people love visuals and visual aids. So I literally was hit in the middle of the night with this brainstorm. Why don't I put these on a tree and build upon the things that we've been talking about today? So I did, aided by some insights from my South Sudanese friends. And here's what I came up with. It's copyright. Honored to say it's been shared widely, but you're welcome to share it if you can violate my copyright and share it if you'd like to. That's perfectly fine. I don't make money on this, I assure you. The notion, my friends, is that I mentioned rights evolve. A tree, in a sense, evolves, meaning it grows. A tree changes. It has limbs, it has leaves that fall off, it has new branches and new twigs, etc. So this captures that. Now let's look at some of the details. And then we'll be around time, Stephen, open for questions.
Okay.
Look at the bottom. The needs or provision rights are listed at the bottom. And just read right across. Shelter, food, water, and sanitation. If you don't have those, if we don't have those, you can't do anything else. You can't move through life, and you can't tackle any other human rights issues you're interested in because you're not living.
I was thinking the same thing. Just like Maslow.
It's similar. I was not thinking of Maslow when I did this, but many people over the last decade have told me that they got to thinking of Maslow when they saw this. So you build on that. Then, if you're lucky enough to have a foundation of those 4 things, then you can move in to consider other things.
Yep.
At the trunk of my tree, you'll notice are the 2 words discourse and debate. Rights evolve through human discourse and debate. And things that happen and don't happen, and things that happen in courts, but also the things that do not in any way happen in courts and judicial systems. Discourse and debate are central to the evolution of human rights. Now you notice on the left and right, I said resources. Well, you got to have resources. Sometimes that's money to help pursue your dream, or maybe other forms of resource too, like a viable network. A network is a viable resource, but you got to have resources if they're going to pursue this, because this chart is all about doing things favorably and understanding rights with an optimistic rather than pessimistic lens. Now you notice in the mid branches of my tree, I have values on the one side and duties on the other. Remember how I mentioned obligations? Go off to the far right side and see where I've written it on the far side right over here.
Yeah.
Obligations are the moral drivers. As we said earlier, they drive this. They relate to duties, what we must do to help folks. But on the other side, values, we must understand people's values. Again, Kathy and I both worked in New Guinea. I can assure you that the tribal people that Kathy and I both had the privilege of working with years ago in New Guinea, myself on socioeconomics, Kathy on ethnomusicology, had values that we learned about. They weren't articulated in the same way as we articulate them here in Denver, Colorado, that's for sure. You have to be open to people's values and interpret and place them in proper cultural context. Two of the most interesting words for me, and they will be for you folks too, are equity and equality. And you'll be interested to know that of those two, both of which are important, I believe equity is the more important of the two terms. Equity has to do with fairness. What's fair for someone? What's fair, even for my dear wife Kathy and I, who were married for over 50 years and very similar in many ways, what's fair in certain ways for Kathy will not be exactly the same as what's fair for me, because I'm a different person. So equity related to fairness has to be kept paramount. Equality is good. We can talk about equality and wanting folks to be equal. Yeah, but let's face it. In many ways, people aren't equal and they never will be equal. What's important is resources related to engender equity, which can help a person. In the center, upper center of my trunk, you'll see protocols, covenants, and declarations. Yes, those, such as you saw in my previous chart, the various UN declarations and others, are very important. That's where on the center part of my tree. But you can see, I didn't want them to dominate. I didn't want a written declaration, as important as it might be, to dominate when this chart is being used by a person, as I'm delighted to say it was, in the Kakuma refugee camp in East Africa, who was not very familiar with the UN declaration. But I was honored to hear through my friend, thought this tree made sense to her. Now you go on up, dignity and justice at the top. You already know what I think about those. But go up on the upper left limb. This is what are called a negative rights. That doesn't mean they're bad. They're negative in this sense. Freedom from something. Freedom from slavery. Freedom from torture. Freedom from rendition, where people are sent to a black hole in another country and you never hear from them again. That's rendition. So those are key. But of course, freedom of are positive rights. Freedom of movement, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, as examples. One of my friends looked at this and said, oh, it kind of got me thinking. I said, well, good, I want you to get you thinking. He said, what about freedom of privacy? I said, what a terrific addition. The value of being private. So on the left-hand side, and then we'll, just a couple minutes, open it to our Q&A. Education as an enabling right. I wanted to mention that last. I believe everything in the tree is important, of course, but I wanted to mention that last because I truly believe, and as do many colleagues, and I'm sure many of you good folks here, education is probably the single most important thing we can do for ourselves and for other people. And when I give my talks on East Africa, I've had the privilege of working there. I still work in East Africa, particularly in South Sudan, which is struggling terribly. If there's a signal, I said it this way to several Rotary friends recently in a presentation. If you had only one thing you could do with your resources as a person who wanted to help with human rights, if you only had one thing you could do, it'd be nice to do 12, but if you only had one thing, what would it be? I always say, girls' education. Girls' education. If there's a single thing that will make the most difference in such developing places and elsewhere in the world too, it is girls' education.
We've got about 8 minutes left.
That's right. And so I've completed my presentation of the charts, and thank you so much for listening. And now we have the exact amount of time we need for Q&A. Jim?
What do you think?
What do you think about the possibility,
Louder, Jim.
what do you think of the possibility and probabilities of China and the United States working together for the betterment of people around the world?
That's a big question, Jim. I'm with you, man. All I can say is, we gotta do it one person at a time, one group at a time, one church at a time, and try to put politics aside as best we can.
It'd be great if that could come
If
about.
it could, you're right, it is pretty darn tough.
People talk about
Yeah.
conflict with China. I think that would be the most stupid war in history.
You know,
We should be working together.
and so to build on your good point and good question, I don't have the easy answer to your good question. Shouldn't we, when we chat with our Chinese colleagues, and I've occasionally had the chance to do that, not often, I'm not a Chinese specialist. Shouldn't we at least be chatting and discussing things collegially? Of course.
Yeah.
That's what always helps, is to meet people and discuss things collegially and diplomatically. What other comments or questions or critiques do you have?
I'm just curious how long you were in El Salvador.
I was there for 8 weeks, leading a USAID team, doing water resource work.
Did you ever go over to Guatemala and deal with
I was at the Guatemalan border,
the Truth Commission and?
but I did not work with that commission. No, I met the people, the Truth Commission people I met were in Timor-Leste in Southeast Asia. But that was important to learn from them too. Steve?
Peter, what do you think is the most interesting or egregious human rights violations going on today? And I'm thinking of human trafficking, gays being killed in Africa for their lifestyle.
Yeah.
And Palestinians also.
I would rank those as among the top, most severe and negative and ominous, absolutely.
Okay,
Museveni, the president of Uganda, while he seemed to be progressive in certain ways, including with the use of his army, which has been pro and con in several neighboring countries as he sends his army in, is an absolute ominous scoundrel. I could say a worse word, but I'm trying to be courteous in a public audience. When it comes to gay rights. And he's the first to say, and I'm paraphrasing, he'll kill a gay person first and maybe give them a trial later. So that is a critical, and thank you for mentioning it again, and I've written about it in my book, as you know. And it's one of the worst, absolutely. There's where power and his need for power, and he wants to be seen as the big man in East Africa for Uganda and beyond. He promotes things like, on the positive side, HIV interventions that are helpful. On the negative side, campaigns against gays. So wrestling with that and trying to work through it. Yeah, Jim.
I
I have a question.
in here, being Christians, that we would agree that Christianity has had Christian principles have positive impact upon the development of human rights. But I'm always interested, I'd be very interested in your take about whether organized religions, the organizations themselves, have had a positive impact or a negative impact on the evolution of human rights. And I'm thinking of specific iconic things like the World War II, Catholic involvement in World War II and the Holocaust there, and some of the organized aspect of religions. Has that been a positive contribution?
In my view, Jim, I'm just one person and it's controversial, of course.
No,
Yeah, I see. I see more positives in what I would call progressive Christianity and what progressive Christians have been able to do than negatives, particularly in the last post-world, in this third era, this post-World War II era.
Okay.
I do. And that's even why I mentioned Irena Sendler, that wonderful Catholic person who saved all of those Jews.
Sure.
And she in part built upon her Christian beliefs in doing that. So, yeah, I see more pluses than negatives. Of course, people get down on proselytizing, on baptizing people in a remote tribal village where the people might have no idea what that baptism means. They barely know the word Jesus Christ, and suddenly somebody wants to baptize them and call them a Christian. I see those as very mixed results. But overall, a lot of good stuff.
I think of a lot of the more fundamental religions that are churches that are speaking and have a pulpit and have a voice
Yeah.
against gay rights and against civil rights for black people and for people of color generally and things like that. That has been the area that has given voice to that discrimination.
Yes, it has.
And that makes me angry.
Yeah.
And I think the principles are there.
The key word is it being inclusive in the way that Jesus exemplified it to all people, including marginalized people. A person came to my door. Maybe I shouldn't say what religion they were, but maybe I will, what denomination they were. They were Jehovah's Witness. And I always try to talk to everybody. I believe in talking to everybody in a civil manner. And as soon as they got into the general issues, I got into the issues of gay rights with our Jehovah Witness friends, and they live not far from us here in the particular congregation, 3 or 4 miles from here. Long and short, in my view, I was very disappointed, as you could probably guess, where I'm going with this in terms of the way they were dealing with gay rights and gay people and being exclusive. If we are inclusive of diverse peoples of every type, man, we'll be one step ahead.
I have a question,
Oh, we have one more question. Okay.
Sure, from
if you have time.
Zoom, you bet, go ahead.
Okay, what do you think of the phrase, equity equals the dumbing down of our society?
Good question. Of course, that's been used by some folks who I don't think are well educated. But thanks for mentioning. I'm not saying you. I'm talking about the people who have used the phrase, but including a couple of unnamed people in Florida. But it's a great question. And in no way does equity dumb down things, because of course, if you truly understand what it is, and it has to do with inclusiveness and fairness and reaching out and doing things, then of course it's totally uplifting and intellectually engaging. Thanks, folks.
Couple minutes left. Let's go ahead and use them. Any more questions or
You work
comments?
with Seeds of Sudan, right? That's where I saw you before.
Yeah.
Have you found that Wagner, the Russian military group, is interfering with your work in Sudan?
Yeah, the Wagner group is an ominous group that is interfering with the rights of the Sudanese people. And you're quite right. I have had the privilege of working in both Sudan and South Sudan on the ground. It's been several years since I've been there, but I still work with them from Denver if I'm not there on site.
Yeah.
And the Wagner group, as basically a mercenary group in Sudan, is also interested in some of the mineral wealth of Sudan, including gold. And when I first went there, people were finding that there was gold in Western Sudan and finding that there was oil in Western Sudan. Now, of course, the oil fields have burgeoned in both Sudan and South Sudan. And the Wagner group, even after the death of Prigozhin, which is likely to have happened this week, the Wagner group will continue, in my opinion, and be a nasty element. I wouldn't be surprised if they were working hand in foot with the Janjaweed, which are the ominous warriors out there who are killing people left and right in what's probably a renewed genocide in Western Sudan.
What's the name?
Peter.
The Janjaweed, it's the Jan, it's spelled Jeweed. From Arabic, that translates to devils on horseback. They have traditionally used horses in their marauding and killing of people such as the Mosulite villagers out there. So we're very sad to say that a second genocide is likely unfolding last year in Western Sudan. I've been to those villages. I've met those nice people. My heart's breaking because I know some of the people I met are dead.
As we wrap up, Peter, go ahead, Carol.
Oh, please.
Question about,
Please.
speaking of mineral resources.
Yes,
With all the demand for electric vehicle batteries and battery storage on the grid, we're gonna need a lot of those minerals.
that's right.
Do you see that being, maybe there's more awareness and pressure coming from?
Good question, my friend. I do, both positive and negative.
Yeah,
If we look at the Democratic Republic of the Congo,
right,
where many key resources of that type, like cobalt,
Yeah.
good for you, are found and mined, often under extreme duress by people who maybe make $1 a day with no, I mean, at gunpoint virtually, digging holes in the ground to get out the cobalt. I do see that as an ominous negative development because it's going to get worse. But there's several international federations afoot, Carol, which are trying hard to, you might say, unionize in a sense, the miners and give them more rights. Because that's going to be needed in this EV, this electrical vehicle era that we're going into. Very good question.
yeah, and investors are asking the
And
question.
investors should be asking,
Yeah.
how were these minerals obtained?
Right.
And was there any kind of a human rights consideration? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Peter, are there any organizations we can join that work for human rights that you would recommend?
Yes. The one I'm most, since I told you how much I believe in a girls' education. The one that I'm blessed to be currently advising several, all pro bono, may I add. Which I'm sure many of you, most of what you do is also pro bono, so you know what I mean, voluntary. My privilege. One of them is Girls with Books. And so that's a relatively new organization sponsoring girls' education in South Sudan, and it's based in Boulder. So if anybody's interested in learning more about Girls with Books, just send me an email. That'd be one of several that I would recommend.
Okay.
They're really doing some great work on human rights and girls' education.
Good. And as we wrap up, I want to give a plug to Peter's books. If you're interested in human rights and other topics, go to Amazon or somewhere else and search for his name and you'll find 5 or more books that he has written. With that, thank you, Peter. Great presentation. Thank you, everybody. Next week is Jamie Martin speaking about the outreach that the church, St. Andrew, is doing. So come back for that. Thanks.
You must be done with research by now.
Well,